and then we'll hear your... Here we go. We should be streaming to the YouTubes. Now we're just waiting for the sound.
Yeah, it's not working again.
Do we have sound there, Simon?
Yeah, it's not working again.
That's okay. I'll just go straight into it. 5, 4, 3, 2. Tēnā koutou katoa. Great to have everyone here on the Hoon for Thursday, March the 14th. I'm Bernard Hickey, the co-host of the Hoon on the Kaka, with Peter Bale, co-host, this time in Wellington. How are you, Peter?
Bernard, yes, I'm in Te Whanganui Aotearoa, down by opposite Te Papa, thinking how lovely it is. Apparently, on a good day, there's few other places in the world nicer than Wellington, but it's just a normal Wellington today, blowing like a bastard. But it was an absolutely beautiful crossing on the Cook Strait ferry today.
Oh, you actually got on a boat that did not sink and actually got across.
Correct, I did. And also what I discovered is that there are 2 Cook Strait ferries, and one of them is quite nice and has actually decent food, and the other one feels like whatever, the New Zealand Steamship Company 1964. But no, it was lovely. And going through Tory Channel.
A Polish shipyard in a boat. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. Going through Tory Channel, you sort of could see, I think National's done cancelling those new ferries. They're clearly too big to go through Tory Channel.
Ah, yeah. It's interesting. I think this will come back to bite them at some point, because essentially, without the roll-on, roll-off railway ferries, which are unusual things globally,
yes,
and that stretch of water is a particularly ugly stretch of water to send people and trains across. We forget that geography is destiny, and and our geography, the 2 islands together with an ugly piece of water in between, determines so much about us. And that response, the roll-on, roll-off ferry, you can't just put a Toyota Corolla in there. You actually need a roll-on, roll-off ferry, and they're expensive, and eventually we're going to have them, because we can't put everything in trucks. And
no, I think it's quite interesting, but I was thinking about that today. Of course, as usual, I only have to cross the channel, cross the strait once to be a complete expert on it, and that we, and also on Hyundai and shipbuilding. But it did strike me that it is a bit of a blow for the South Island. I think I passed maybe 3 cars this morning in an hour and a half drive to the, and a couple of trucks. But the South Island does get short shrift in terms of economic development and connection to the north and infrastructure, I suspect. So, I don't know. It just seems a bit short-sighted. Our friend Patrick doesn't think so, I don't believe, but he's less certain about it than I am.
It really depends on how big you think New Zealand should be in terms of numbers of people, and also how important you think it is to get these big 50-ton trucks off the road, which topically are subject to road user charges, which many people think don't reflect the damage they do to the roads.
No, well, the good thing is we're all going to be subject to road user charges on everything, including your electric bike now, I see.
So I will
Brown
be
says you're basically the same as
trucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. So this week it's going to be a big Wellington focus in this week's Hoon, because the big news today, the sort of thing I get very excited about and focused on, is the Wellington City Council is considering a district plan.
Yes.
Now, before that sends you to sleep, it's the
most not at all. I think it's. I couldn't imagine talking about any. In fact, if I just pulled the string on your back, I suspect that you'd talk for the next 29 minutes about that.
Oh boy, let me start. No, but we are going to talk to some other people about that. Stuart Donovan is going to come on, an economist who focuses on this area of urbanisation and urban development economics at Motu, and has been following the debates around the Independent Hearings Panel report on the district plan, which was subject to the medium density residential standard upgrades in the National Policy Statement, urban development upgrades. Just in case you think that
I think we've lost 2/3 of the audience just now in that. Yeah, carry on.
I didn't use any acronyms. That was my start. Now I'd start using acronyms now that I've introduced them. But it, and NIMBYs. And if we can't
Excellent.
build affordable homes in our biggest city, our capital city, to allow young people to live and work there in a reasonably affordable fashion, that city is dead. That city you're in right now is just
Well, didn't Chris Bishop?
husk.
I mean, we can get to this when we do the property section, because we don't want to make this into a property podcast with an international affairs one attached, kind of like the country. Didn't Chris Bishop talk about having 10 million people in New Zealand, and how exciting that would
he
be
is
if we
one of
doubled the
those-
size of our cities?
Yeah, he's one of those in favour of a big New Zealand. The trouble is, he hasn't talked to anyone in the National Party about it, and certainly there are an awful lot of National Party supporters, blue rinses and all, coming out and saying, "Hang on a minute, I didn't vote for all these extra people." Well, except for the ones who do work for me and pay me rent, we can have those, but just not near me.
And no bloody foreigners.
No.
And don't forget, we're all going to be Kiwis, Bernard. Nothing else. We're just going to be Kiwis.
And the key thing is to have cheap cafe lattes, cheap Ubers, cheap Uber Eats, and not have to pay for the infrastructure in the houses to look after all these
Well,
people.
as we've said before, and I was thinking about this week with the discussions about the landlord tax and various other things which we'll talk about, is we have that. I was thinking again as I was getting on the ferry this morning, that if we let Shane Jones have his way, he will find or arrange to be found so much oil and gas off New Zealand that we can export it all and create a sovereign wealth fund like Norway, like Statoil did, like the Norwegian sovereign oil fund, start paying maybe 45% tax and $20 for a glass of beer, and we'll be away at the races. We'll have a sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
We'll have the largest we'll be the largest adopter of electric cars, like Norway is, and we'll just export all of our pollution, our fossil fuels overseas. Brilliant, job done. Thanks,
So
Shane.
the trouble is, we won't be able to sell anything else overseas because the Europeans and the Chinese and a
Have
bunch
to.
of others
We'll have enough
will
bloody
not
food
buy
to feed New Zealand.
our meat.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. What do we do with all that land? Do we keep growing milk powder and lamb chops,
Pine trees.
or do we plant pine trees? Certainly
Yeah.
that's a topic we can talk about this week. The government was challenged by the Climate Commission to essentially put up the price of fuel by removing the number of credits to be sold into the emissions trading scheme, and to essentially use the emissions trading scheme as a really tight vice on emissions, which there's a bunch of
Spelled
libertarian economists that
VISE. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. A bunch of libertarian economists and ACT and others have said, well, just let the ETS rip, and we'll get our emissions down to wherever we want them to be just by moving the price dial, which they haven't really thought through, because that means much higher petrol prices. And at the moment that starts to flow through into those big gleaming digital billboards outside petrol stations, and it turns up on a 6 o'clock news program, that won't last long. So this is one of the issues here for the government, is it's making lots of commitments to itself and to everyone else, not thinking through what it means in the long run for prices.
It's very
inflation.
short term. I think New Zealand's political period, does encourage a great deal of short termism, which is one of the reasons I was thinking today, apart from thinking about Shane Jones and Freddie the Frog and Goodbye Freddie, that I understand the 100-day thing, given the it is a very managerial thing by Christopher Luxon, but it's it does take so long to get things moving normally in New Zealand. So maybe that 100-day thing is a good sort of signal, at least, of impetus, even if you haven't thought any of it out.
Yeah, it does give the impression of action and of something's happening here. Actually, when you look at what's on, they are simply shutting down a whole bunch of legislation. They're repealing a bunch of things. they've repealed Three Waters, the Natural and Built Environments Act, the Spatial Planning Act. Just today, we've had news that the special natural areas are gone. The Resource Management Act is gone. The smoke-free rules are gone. This is a repealer-palooza. And it's
that's
okay to remove
Bernard. That's a very. Did you put that in this Kaka this week? That's a goodie. That one.
I have used it in various places, and I'll claim credit for it. But definitely, it is a repealer-palooza. We've had an amazing 17 bills passed under urgency in 7 weeks, a record for any government in the MMP. And it is a frenzy of apparent action, which actually is a frenzy of turning things off and stopping things, which is, you could argue, and they would argue, we were elected to do this, and we've done it.
Oh, we're slicing through red tape.
Oh, by the way, David Seymour's new regulatory ministry will have 3 times as many people as the Productivity Commission it's replacing. So, good fun.
I was quite struck that it has that woman Grania Moss running it as well, who did such a brilliant job at Orangatamariki.
Yeah, well, I was obviously involved at a newsroom in reporting on the qualities of Grania Moss and the problems at Orangatamariki, so I have some views on that. And certainly she is well connected with the national side of the fence and quite popular with certain groups within there. But let's see what happens there. I think David Seymour may have a few issues to crop up around that. I mean, the sheer fact that they're replacing one agency, the Productivity Commission, with another one with 3 times as many people seems to fly in the face of all of the noise about, getting rid of all those useless bureaucrats. And, the rubber really has to hit the road here for the government on,
especially the road, Bernard. It certainly isn't going to be the rails, the wheels hitting the railway tracks. It's definitely, we want more rubber on these roads.
More rubber on these roads and more roads, and that's why I'm always amazed why National's campaign slogan was "Let's get New Zealand back on track." What actually meant to say was "Let's get New Zealand back on the road."
Absolutely, and then run over small children when you remove the speed bumps in Herne Bay like they're going to. Now, look, Bernard, I was saying to you, I'm sorry, carry on.
Yeah, Simeon Brown is painting himself a heartless extremist. This week, for example, he said that the various reports of how many kids are killed and how often they're killed at various speed limits around schools, he simply said, well, there are a range of forecasts on these issues.
Exactly. Yeah, dear Mrs. Smith, I'm sorry about Johnny having been squashed by a double cab ute. It's always double cab utes, as you know. Yeah, and Bernard, look, I was really struck by your soliloquy last week. And at the big I can't remember quite where it was on the show. Your thing about media after I had criticised some of the shallowness or some of the dominant youth kind of approaches on New Zealand media and not separating comment and so on. And you gave a really brilliant soliloquy, and I think we should have more of it. And I think you're going to do one towards the end of the show about housing and prime ministers and landlords, right?
Yes. At the end of the show, I shall soliloquy is a fancy word for a rant. And a certain point of view, hopefully informed and useful. And I do have some thoughts on some of the problems there, which for those who are subscribers to the Kaka, you will have read a sneak preview of them in today's email, which I have now opened up to the public after.
Excellent. Oh, good on you. Was that one of those tell people the way it is, please, Bernard? Say Kaka subscribers.
Yeah, and also challenge the statements of the Prime Minister on how the economy works, and I've done that today with some.
When we do it, I'd quite like to challenge possibly with your person, because there's been a lot of comment from people like a chap called Liam Hare, who's a lawyer, I think in Palmerston North or somewhere, who seems to be relatively on the right, talking about the incompetence of journalistic questions about this. Given that effectively they've only just brought in the rental, brought being a landlord in line with every other form of investment, and I think you and I both know why that isn't exactly true, but it is a good line. Sort of also in media news, Bernard, and thinking of soliloquies and rantograms, I think we might need to stage an intervention on Sean Plunkett, because I sent you a rantogram of his, which I'm not sure whether you got a chance to listen to, where he tied together the left-wing Liberal judiciary, the left-wing media, the New Zealand Rugby Board, and said that it was all part of
in there as well. No?
It was a part of a conspiracy for a revolution in New Zealand, starting with that haka. I mean, it's just absolutely bonkers. And so, following on from using the word pogrom entirely inappropriately, but then he also went out and described, used the word terrorist. I think he qualified it by saying something like proto, but used the word terrorist to describe Chloe Swarbrick. So I'm very much hoping that we've got a couple of KCs on the case in our show who might give Chloe a ring and just say this about these remarks that Mr. Plunkett has made to you. Do you want to just run it through the law courts? But
you make a really interesting point there about US style media economics, and that's what we're talking about here, which is Sean Plunkett has been given some money by a rich childcare chain operator to make a splash and to turn up at press conferences and ask awkward questions and to play a role, a sort of a Hannity-style role in New Zealand, which is fine. In America, they have quite relaxed laws on defamation, which means you can say pretty much anything about anyone. And sure, there might be some legal action, and it's interesting that Donald Trump has been found guilty of defamation.
Yes, and then goes on to repeat it. But I was thinking, actually, listening to Sean on this thing, that he was actually even Alex Jones-ish, more than Hannity. He was talking about here are the easy, he was musing about the easy ways to create a revolution in New Zealand. And when you start messing with the judiciary, I think you're in really serious trouble here. It's also thinking that some Liberal fiasco. And while we're on that subject of the judiciary, Bernard, I sent you what I thought was a really interesting piece by Audrey Young from the Herald, using her decades of wisdom to talk to Shane Jones about what I hadn't noticed is effectively the removal this week, or the discovery this week, that the National Coalition Government has removed and is removing from all departmental legislation the requirements or phrases around the requirements to honour the Treaty of Waitangi. And I find that absolutely extraordinary. And then Shane is pitching this idea that, in fact, ministers will decide what is and is not compliant with the Treaty of Waitangi, rather than lawyers. Or as he said lawyers, but of course it's the judiciary. And that seems to me to fly in the face of the last 40 years, really, where the judiciary has been so crucial, including the Waitangi Tribunal, but particularly the Supreme Court and the High Court, or Supreme Court really, about these really the critical embedding of the Treaty of Waitangi principles as they've become known or understood. The decisions of the judiciary have been really crucial to that, and seems to me beneficial.
Yeah, it is quite a change in our pseudo-constitutional arrangements when a minister and a government on the fly, and this is the weakness of our system, single chamber of parliament, no written constitution. Essentially, once you're the prime minister and you have control of cabinet in your own caucus room, you can do anything. And that's why, in a way, we had MMP, and why there were various attempts using the human rights legislation and the Bill of Rights to try to, provide some guardrails against a Robert Muldoon special. It's interesting, the Post and the Press this week have used the phrase Muldoon to describe Shane Jones and Christopher Luxon and David Seymour, and we have a triumvirate, a Muldoonish triumvirate now. But we really do. And what's weird is that David Seymour, despite falling off his bike this week, seems to be in the driver's seat. He whatever you think of him, he is an incredibly skilled politician.
He is playing this like a chap I watched at the Buller River yesterday, at the mouth of the Buller River yesterday, fly fishing. That's David Seymour, and he's got the media out there as trout and his people. And I'm just going to extend this fly fishing metaphor probably a little too far. But also, did you see the job that I'm now going to apply for, Bernard? Press secretary to David Seymour.
Oh boy, that is going to be entertaining. I suspect that will.
I think that would be bloody. I think it would be. I'm pretty sure I could swallow every piece of morality and principle that I've got and go and do that, because it would be quite entertaining.
Well, you would have to stay in Wellington for a start. Mind you,
Yeah.
you'd spend
Oh,
all
yeah.
your time on a plane flying around the country. Unfortunately, your duties on, on the Hoon would be finished, but it would.
Oh, do you think that would
certainly
disqualify
be-
me, Bernard, from being a? I wouldn't have to be a member of ACT. I'd only be an employee. Well, I'd be a government. I think your press secretary is a government employee, isn't he?
Yeah, well, they would stop you for a start, but certainly.
No, we believe in freedom.
mean-
ACT believes in freedom,
Freedom.
Bernard. We can do what we bloody like. In a libertarian world, you'll be able to have
Unless-
people
unless
on the
it's-
Hoon who
unless
actually
it's-
represent the ACT party for once properly.
That's right. I mean, do whatever you want as long as it doesn't block out the view of your next door neighbour and steal their.
That's
data.
right.
Then you can't.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Robert, how are
It
you?
is
Professor
wonderful.
Robert Patman,
Good afternoon.
our marvellous
Fine, thank you. How
international
are you?
affairs person. I don't mean international affairs as in being naughty. I just mean international affairs as in detailed analysis.
Should hope not.
Yeah.
No,
How are you getting
it is
on? I mean,
lovely to
I
see
was
you, Robert.
Good
I
to
was
see you,
quite
Bernard.
struck,
Good to see you,
Robert,
Peter.
after we talked last week about how pathetic Biden looked relative to Netanyahu, that very night in the State of the Union address, he announced I don't think they're calling it Project Exodus.
The decision to build the port.
Yeah. I mean, it is just extraordinary, isn't it? All these ships are sitting in Cyprus waiting to come across to a kind of Mulberry D-Day thing that's being built off Gaza.
Yeah,
going on?
I think it's buying Israel more time. Basically, Mr. Biden seems to be just unable to say to the Netanyahu government, which is an extremist government, that enough is enough. And they're going to extraordinary lengths to deflect on this issue. But we should take into account that 4/5 of the munitions that have been raining in on the Palestinians come from the United States. And it's an extraordinary situation. Mr. Biden is feeling the heat, and he's going to some lengths to try to deflect that heat. We had the 38,000 meals airdropped, and now we have a 2-month project to build a port. Although there's no arrangements in place
To distribute it once
the
you get
aid
there.
is
Yeah.
delivered,
Yeah.
the Israelis will
Well, they
reserve
could
the
form
right
a human
to check
chain if they hadn't killed all the humans, but carry on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another 2 months at the current rate will mean that we'll be looking at 40,000 dead.
But so just you reckon he's doing the least he can do in a sense, like he's not actually pulling the lever that would actually make a difference.
He seems very reluctant to do that, and there is growing impatience. What I have noticed is a growing number of senators, not just in the Democrats, where there's at least 8, including Bernie Sanders, but there's a number of other highly regarded senators who have become very critical indeed. And some also in the Republican Party. So there was a pointed exchange between administration officials, which I think some of our viewers may have seen and listeners, in which a Republican senator, whose name escapes me for the moment, you may be able to remind me of it, who asked 2 White House officials, including Avril Haines, who is intelligence person, CIA, and Nicholas Burns, head of CIA. Sorry, Nicholas Burns, and I think Avril Haines is another area of intelligence. But asked both of them is it true Israel was exterminating Palestinians? And got, of course, a loaded question. But it was very interesting to see them basically deflect the question. And so they looked very uncomfortable indeed. And I think that is the position of the administration. But I think Biden's judgment is he really must hold the line with Israel, given the looming election. I think it's a misjudgment. I think in politics sometimes you do have to do the thing that is right rather than what you think is politically expedient.
Yeah, it's interesting. But one of the slightly more conspiratorial takes on the WARF idea is that it's all part of America and Israel combining to take control of the gas assets that are just off Gaza. And as you know, Turkey and Israel exploit the gas assets off Israel. Between the two of them. And then you've got that interesting question with Lebanon. I mean, it is an interesting thought because I think the Israelis, as far as I know, have blocked Gaza from exploiting or having kind of the rights to its own gas off Gaza because it would feed too much revenue into Hamas. But it is one of those kind of dreamy ideas that you could have a tiny little sliver of petrostate there that could have a rather elegant Corniche Beirut style before they accidentally blew up most of Beirut. But there's no reason that Gaza needs to be quite as bad as it is.
If there is an economic plan or plot through building the port, I think Joseph Borrell, the visiting EU foreign policy chief, who's in Washington at the moment, made it quite clear that the Europeans are in the process of major sea change, and said some pretty, I think, uncomfortable things to the administration while in Washington, and made it quite clear the current situation can't go on. So I think Washington is increasingly finding itself isolated on this issue along with Israel. It seems that Mr. Biden believes that he can ride it out with his port scheme and delivering airdrop meals. I'm not sure about that. And the thing is that I do think the election is influencing his judgment, but he also is to some extent becoming hostage now to Mr. Netanyahu's desire to continue the war as possible. And a lot of Israeli observers who are critical of Netanyahu are warning the Americans that they're miscalculating if they think that Netanyahu is going to deliver for Mr. Biden and so serve his interests.
Robert, I wanted to also ask you about it. I mean, you will have seen an Israeli attack, it appears, on an UNRWA aid distribution place in Gaza, I think overnight. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about UNRWA with you, or get you to talk to us about it, because it is an interesting agency. The more every day something worse happens, the more a certain group of people that I follow on Twitter or on X who are extraordinarily pro-Israel will attack UNRWA as a Hamas-affiliated, and the Israel popular group in New Zealand. I forget it's run by, I think, David Cuman. Constantly talks about Helen Clark's involvement in UNRWA in the past. And then there's this issue that you see again brought up time and again by pro-Israel people about why Palestinians are still classed as refugees since the Nakba was in 1947-48. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective, or what the perspective should be on UNRWA, its place in UN, and this question of whether Palestinians are in fact refugees?
Well, I think I'm going to upset the pro-Israeli lobby by saying that UNRWA, according to the Biden administration, has been doing a very good job, an indispensable job, to quote an administration official, in distributing aid in very difficult circumstances. There 13,000 employees, 12 have been suspected and dismissed, although their cases are still actually being investigated. So they were not given the benefit of the doubt. They were given, if you like, the push before the verdict was confirmed. Presumably they'll be reinstated if they are found to be innocent. But look, in an organisation of 13,000 people in a hotspot like Gaza, remember this, a lot of people talk as if the whole situation suddenly happened on the 7th of October. Gaza was under blockade for 16 years, which is an act of war, by the way, under international law. So it was a pretty dire humanitarian situation when 500 trucks of food aid were allowed in per day before the 7th of October. That figure has reduced to less than 100, and food is being used as a weapon of war. And so, in a sense, I'm not surprised that UNRWA is becoming, under the gun, particularly with the ICJ
Yes.
situation involvement.
International Court of Justice.
This is a very nice
the
deflection
plausible
strategy.
genocide thing. Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
if Israel could, if the Netanyahu government, it's unfair to say Israel, if the Netanyahu government could distinguish between civilians and military targets in what it was doing in trying to, as it put it, annihilate Hamas, which appears to be a fantasy. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt for the moment. Let's just say, okay, that achievement is available to them. That would have a lot more credibility if they were consistently able to protect the civilian population, as they should under humanitarian law. It's very bad counter-terrorist strategy to kill innocent people. All they're doing through their strategy is endanger the future of Israel. And friends of Israel, by the way, should be critical and should be saying your strategy at the moment is actually
It's putting
a
Israel in
recipe
jeopardy.
for long-term extremism in the region.
Yeah.
And this point needs to be made. On the UNRWA thing, I found it interesting. UNRWA for a long time has been a target of the Netanyahu government. I don't think it's an unblemished organisation. Few are. There's bad apples in most organisations, and there's one or two possibly in the Netanyahu government as well. Mm-hmm. People who do not observe, who've described Palestinians in pretty extreme terms, human animals and other descriptions like that. But, at the end of the day, it's a thankless task trying to distribute humanitarian aid in a situation in which is under severe siege at the moment. And, we're talking at a time when Palestinian children are dying from malnutrition. And
No, exactly.
the situation's getting worse.
And Robert, do you want to address this question of whether Palestinians are still refugees and whether that is a legitimate kind of... I find it quite extraordinary because, of course, that was one of the great post-war refugee crises in the Nakba, and we still have Palestinian refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon, of course, in the West Bank and Gaza. What about this question about acknowledging them as refugees? Is there some... Do pro-Israel people have a point?
Well, the way I look at it is that it's very difficult to go back to the 48 situation precisely. I don't think the disestablishment of Israel is possible, and I don't think it should happen. But I take the view that Resolution 242 of 1967 did provide a bit of a roadmap, which was the return of the territories that Israel conquered through the 67 war, which includes West Bank, the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was formally returned to the Palestinians in 2005, but the problem is it's been under blockade ever since because Hamas won the election there. The Golan Heights remains under Israel's control. Under international law, this is an occupation of Palestinian territory. East Jerusalem.
I would. Let's not get. You're getting great feedback, including from people saying, "What is your solution, and do you want to keep Hamas in Gaza?"
My solution? My solution is a two-state solution, which was envisaged by the 67 resolution. Let's be quite clear about this. There is not a military solution to this problem. It's a political problem. It's reconciling Israel's understandable desire for greater security with the Palestinians' understandable desire after 75 years to be able to exercise the right of political self-determination and achieve their own state. If you want to defang Hamas, then provide a clear pathway for a Palestinian state. While, if anything, the current situation is boosting Hamas, it's not weakening it.
Robert, you're a poet, and people will be thrilled that I'm not interrupting you every 2 seconds as well. But before I hand over to Bernard, who wants you to put your armchair soldier bloody pipe smoking military Colonel Bloodknock to bear, the rather fascinating meeting this week with the Prime Minister of Hungary and Donald Trump, after which the Prime Minister of Hungary said Donald Trump is not going to give a cent to Ukraine. Said to Donald, I mean, what the hell is going on there?
Well, friends of mine in Europe describe Orban as a Putin asset. the same accusation has been made against Mr. Trump. They both have a very big soft spot for Vladimir in the Kremlin. So I think Mr. Putin must be, if he's a religious man, and he claims he must be praying for Trump's victory, which is looking more likely than it was 6 months ago. The visit at Mr. Trump's base in Florida, I'm not surprised. They're soulmates. I mean, Mr. Trump described Mr. Orban in the most extravagant terms. A great leader, a courageous man. Yes, Orban's a populist whose support has been increasingly questioned. He's been the subject of some mass demonstrations recently. But yeah, we shouldn't be surprised that, I see this as analogous to Trump's praise for Bolsonaro, who he also described. And also at one time before they had a tiff, Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson. By the way, is an incredible situation at the moment. He said he's hoping to persuade Trump to have a rethink over his stance towards Ukraine. But otherwise, they're soulmates. So, I mean, what do we make of it? Well, I suppose populist solidarity and strong men as they see themselves. I mean, it's quite predictable. I mean, he'll be delighted by Trump's plans to leave NATO, which apparently is one on the agenda, and also, he'll be pleased by the fact that Mr. Trump has plans to emasculate the media, apparently. So in the United States, so I mean, I think they share a pretty, they share a political perspective, and it is an indication that Mr. Trump is thinking ahead, and who could it be his allies internationally, I suppose.
Just Robert, just thinking about the connections between what's happening in the Middle East and in the Ukraine, I note that there's an awful lot of US military aid going to Israel, all sorts of munitions. But one of the problems that the West, I suppose you could call it, is finding is that in a very old school way, we're seeing Russia outproduce the West in terms of munitions. Interesting CNN article I'll include in the show notes for the podcast, showing that Russia is currently producing 3 times as many shells, those boring old shells, the 155 millimeter shells that you plug out of a big old tube, 3 times as many as the entire Western production. So the United States, Europe, Britain, and the likes. And it will take a year or two for the West to sort of catch up. So I just wonder, we've heard of some of the setbacks in Ukraine in the last wee while, despite the spectacular drone attacks on some refineries and ships and things. Is the rest of the world going to come to its senses a bit too late for the Ukrainians?
Well, it's possible, but I wouldn't underestimate. I was reading one account, which is credible, is that 3 separate drone attacks have knocked out 10% of Russia's oil producing capacity in the last 2 days. So I think we are seeing, but mind you, Ukraine have also taken some heavy punishment. They've lost 2 Patriot batteries, amongst other things. And that's a big loss. I mean, these are, really valued assets. They lost also one HIMARS site, or launcher, I should say. So, I mean, it's certainly, this munitions situation is a worry. One thing that slightly puzzled me, and perhaps Peter or yourself could throw light on this, is that the Americans, since December, have kept saying they couldn't deliver any more military aid until they got congressional support. But they have just signed off $300 million in emergency munition support, which they admitted will only keep Ukraine going for a while. But I do think some European states are stepping up, and it may not be enough, or it may not be quick enough. Germany is certainly transforming its production of military capabilities. The other thing is, I do see, with the incursion across the border at Belgorod this week and at Kursk by
the Siberian
Russian
regiment.
anti-Putin forces, this is significant. And yes, I should imagine they'll be quickly repelled, but I think the strategy of bringing the war home to Putin is going to intensify. In other words, yes, those munitions really, the balance of munitions is very much in Russia's favor, but I have a sense that the Ukrainians have decided not to slug it out toe to toe, in which that advantage would really make a major decisive advantage for Russia. I think they're trying to get around the problem by taking the war into Russia's heartland and undermining Putin in the eyes of his own people, particularly with an election looming.
Yeah, and Robert, apart from having you talk so long today, which has been totally brilliant, and people are saying, thank Christ he's shut up and stopped interrupting him. It was interesting to see Putin yet again playing the nuclear card in a conversation with Dmitry Kiselyev from Russian television, which was almost as bonkers, but at least a little more direct than and less sycophantic really than Tucker Carlson's interview with him. But he's really pushing this idea of Russian nuclear superiority. The battlefield weapons are there to be used, they're weapons, and of course talking about the trigger potentially being troops on the ground. And of course we know from that bizarre German leak last week, the interception of somebody's landline from their hotel, or mobile phone from their hotel in Singapore, that the British and French are in fact in and on the ground in Ukraine. Would appear that the British are driving in their Storm Shadow cruise missiles in SUVs, and then helping the Ukrainians target them and use them. The risks of people being exposed on the foreign troops being kind of exposed in that way on the ground and triggering something else seems very much in Putin's mind.
Yes, but if you invade another country, a very large country as well, and you take 20% and you occupy 20% of their land, don't expect they're not going to turn to every bit of support they can get. And let's be quite clear, as Boris Johnson said right at the outset, I think it's one of the few statements I've ever agreed with Boris Johnson, and he said that all Western liberal countries have a vested interest in Putin failing in his attempt to annex Ukraine. So, yeah, Mr. Putin is deeply concerned about assistance for Ukraine.
He's probably worried about it affecting his election chances on the 17th, isn't he, Robert?
Bluff. This is classic. This is mobster behaviour. He's saying, if you back the country I'm trying to subdue, I might just nuke you. Well, the Chinese will have strong words with him. He does that. And what's more, if he did nuke Ukraine or nuke people in Western Europe, don't think Mr. Putin wouldn't face catastrophic response, because they would. And
so will you be staying up on the 17th, Robert, to see how he gets on in the election?
Or to see how much he's won by?
Yeah, exactly. Will it be 97 or?
I think it's 99.8% this time. He's after all prevented anybody from running who could compete with him.
There's no betting market. I can go on and put my money on the opposite.
Yes. Somebody from.
There is something interesting that's developing. Yulia Navalny, who's the widow of Navalny,
Alexei,
of course, who died in detention. She's indicating that they're supporting the Navalny organization, trying to persuade Russians not to vote. How much that's going to have a say, I don't know. But Mr. Putin, I think, is still in dangerous ground here, because he's been in power a long time, and there's only so many, even in an authoritarian state, there's only so many times you can go on blaming everybody else for not delivering the goodies to your own people. And lots of Russians know that his inner circle are fabulously wealthy. With 118 oligarchs having 45% of Russia's wealth, you can work out quickly that many average Russians are doing it tough, as Mr. Luxon says. But I think his position is much more precarious.
I think we need to let you just run on all the time now.
No,
I still have your own podcast at this rate.
Robert, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Robert. It's really good to see you.
And we'll talk again next week.
Thank you.
We have many people looking forward to the discussion next week. I'd like to welcome into the show now a new guest to the Hoon, Stuart Donovan, who I've been following on all sorts of platforms and places where he puts out research and interesting comments on housing economics and housing. You could argue he's an even bigger housing geek than me. Stuart, lovely to have you on the Hoon. Great to see you.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Hi, Stuart. You look as though
Hi.
you're commanding a drone from some airbase in Nevada, are you?
Yeah, I am. I have a housing control center here in Brisbane, and I try and monitor housing across the rest of the
Excellent.
world.
Bernard will be thrilled.
The idea of Stuart rezoning the world's great cities is just my idea of a fun time. Stuart, it has been a huge day for Aotearoa and our capital city. Could you give us and our audience, who maybe aren't following the independent hearings panel in the Wellington District Plan that closely, why today's votes from the Wellington Council were so important?
Yeah, I think for the city, it's a bit of a step change. Historically, Wellington has had relatively low rates of building, house building in particular, Wellington City Council. I'm talking about specifically here. Other councils in Wellington have done better, worth noting that Lower Hutt has done very well. And so what the council's decided to do today is enable a lot more housing especially in quite central locations. And part of that is they had to because of what the central government was requiring, and part of it was they chose to, and they chose to go a bit further in a couple of areas. So it's really a very strong signal from this council that they want to enable housing, which is quite positive in my view.
Because we've been down a dark blind alley in the last couple of months, haven't we? With the independent hearings panel, which is a group of
NIMBYs.
property planners.
NIMBYs, I
and
think we can call them, Bernard.
Sorry?
NIMBYs, I think we can call them, don't you
Numbers.
think?
Well, no, these are professional people who have been appointed to consider the legal rights and wrongs of how Wellington zones are arranged and responding to the medium density residential standards put through by initially a Labor and National bipartisan position. And then, of course, the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, this general push over years now by central government to get local government to densify. But this independent hearings panel did something absolutely extraordinary. They received submissions and they looked at and they listened to advice, but they only took seriously advice from people they actually physically saw and essentially downzoned the district plan in a way that meant, and in a way that they said was, supply doesn't matter in a market. There's no point in zoning for more houses because you'll never have affordable housing in Wellington. It's special. And, if the council had rubber stamped this thing, it would have then gone to Chris Bishop to chew up and spit out. But certainly it was an extraordinary thing. Can you give us a sense, Stuart, of the shock and the way this hit in Wellington?
Well, I think it's quite remarkable actually, because if you step back and you think about the design of this process, where council proposes a district plan and it goes to an independent panel, I think the idea initially was that these independent panels, which every council around New Zealand is going to have to submit a proposed plan to these panels, or every urban council. The idea was the panels would be a check on councils. So the idea is that councils would try and weasel out of their obligations under the legislation for the National Policy Statement and the medium density residential standards. And what's happened in Wellington is exactly the opposite of what I think everyone expected, which was that the council actually were quite, I think, responded genuinely to the legislation. I would have preferred, I would have preferred them to go further in some areas, and a lot of other people felt that way too. But I think they genuinely tried to respond to the legislation, and then the panel started knocking them back. And saying, actually, we're not going to agree to, or we don't recommend you upzone as much as you have. And I don't think anyone anticipated that. So it was a shock.
And to be fair, the Auckland Independent Hearings Panel on the Unitary Plan in 2016 were quite progressive as well. This
went
one,
exactly the other.
yeah, has come out of the blue.
Yeah, so it does raise some questions, I think, for central government about the process. So a key distinction between the Auckland hearings and the panel and the Wellington panel is that in Auckland, the central government appointed the commissioners or the members of the panel, and they chose, I think, quite a diverse range of professions to be represented, including there was an economist on board. And I think people matter. I think people matter, and I don't want to sort of blame the panel, because I think it's we've got to look at the process and say, why didn't the process give us the outcomes we expected in this case? And I think part of it is just the makeup of the panel, and I think central government should be looking at that and saying, are we asking the right people to assess economic evidence?
Can both of you address maybe what are the actual next 3 years, 3 to 5 years implications of this? And can we also have a short applause for whoever on the New Zealand Herald headlined this, crowded houses?
There's been some great headlines. The journalists have been doing
But where does this take? Where does this lead? Are we just going to be talking about this again in 5 years? What are the implications for Auckland, since nobody really lives in Wellington, Bernard?
That's a bit rude, but also
yeah.
Go for it, Stuart.
Well, I mean, in Wellington's case, the council's decisions now go to central government, and Minister Bishop has to decide whether he agrees with the areas where they've diverged from the panel's recommendations, and I hope he does. In terms of the wider implications for Auckland, there's not really a lot in some respects. I mean, it's not like the Auckland panel can look at the Wellington experience and sort of directly say we're gonna give weight to that. But I would expect it would send a few shockwaves, I think, through the professional planning community in New Zealand, to the level of scrutiny that's been applied to the panel's recommendations in Wellington, and the extent to which central government has, across the political spectrum, said we want more housing. We actually want the emphasis to be given, if in doubt, zone up and out, I think is the general mantra that is coming through. And I mean, really, in Wellington's case, the takeaway message is that political leadership matters. Like the politicians in Wellington stood up and said, when we're going to enable more housing than you have recommended.
We hope
yes,
this is a key moment in the story, and a fork in the road where we go forward. But there's always a reaction. There's always blowback, and it's interesting that there was a real celebration back in 2016. 2022, when National and Labour came together with the MDRS plans. It seemed that finally we had some sort of bipartisan agreement pushing back at the forces of reactionary conservatism. But Chris Bishop, for all of his positive championing of urbanisation, is a fish out of water in the National Party on that front, and he eventually had to concede as well. I mean, you get quite different answers when I don't know if you've ever been to these National Party meetings where Chris Bishop stands up and says apartments are good and gets shouted down by lots of people with blue hair. But it is, I don't think the story's over here yet, and it will be very interesting to see whether Chris Bishop ticks the boxes, and whether or not there is blowback within the National Caucus that starts to push back at all this stuff.
Yeah. No, totally agree. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I just wanted to get across before we finished, Stuart, because you've done a lot of great work on this, and you've cited great work. And there's still a bunch of people who say supply doesn't matter, upzoning, that the land bankers and the developers will never build anyway, and we're all wasting our time. Let's just stick with the villas. What does the evidence show us, not just in New Zealand but elsewhere, about upzoning, rental affordability, and housing affordability? You know, it's really at the heart of this YIMBY versus NIMBY debate.
Yep. Yep. I mean, I would summarize the evidence as very much showing that upzoning helps enable supply, especially when the upzoning is large and broad, and that's what Auckland has done, and now Wellington has done, and that definitely helps to bring rents down. I have a friend here in Brisbane who says that there's no such thing as a silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot, and I think upzoning is.
We'll be borrowing that. Thank you, Stuart. Yep.
Yeah, it's a great expression. I see upzoning as being necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to getting all of the outcomes.
Yep.
We want. You know, we have to do it. It has immediate effect for a lot of people. It allows Kangaroa to supply more state housing and so on. But it doesn't solve all our problems. But nothing ever does. We obviously have some ongoing challenges around infrastructure, especially in Wellington, that we're going to need to work through. But yeah, this is necessary to achieving anything else that we want to do.
And Bernard,
Stuart,
you were going to. Do you want to stay on, Stuart, while Bernard does a little? Bernard was last week did a superb soliloquy about media and the shape of New Zealand, and today he's going to do a little one about whether, in fact, tax deductibility for landlords is a good thing, whether it is, in fact, an incentive to landlords and a sop to landlords, or it's just evening out the playing field with other kinds of investment. Bernard, I'm metaphorically pulling that string on your back.
Yes, no, that's good. Teeing me up, as they say, and soliloquy is a fancy word for strongly expressed views, and the letters R, A, and T. But I'm actually going to combine them. Today was an historic day in not just our economy, our political economy, where a group of mostly young people rose up against what they saw as a completely out of touch group of industry professionals telling them that they couldn't live in the city that they love, and that essentially I think that IHP report, the one that now appears to have been rejected by the council, was the death notice for our biggest city. That's a strong comment. But we did have a Prime Minister describe our capital city as a dying city. I think that IHP report, the downzoning of Wellington, which is already brutally downzoned, would have been the death notice for Wellington. And I think the media have played a big role here. Now, I'm obviously connected to the spin-off because I produce a weekly podcast there. But the spin-off have employed one journalist with donations from the public and members, and used all sorts of clever and interesting business models to support the employment of one journalist, Joel McManus, to launch what he called the war on Wellington, which essentially is, let's densify and urbanize Wellington. Let's make it an affordable place to live with lots of apartments and townhouses. Let's do to Wellington what the unitary plan has done to Auckland, which, when you look at the charts, shows you that rents as a multiple of incomes or a share of incomes has fallen in Auckland over the last decade, in large part because it's now easier to build townhouses and apartments. The likes of Ockham and many others, including Kangaroa, Simplicity Living, have built an awful lot of houses in Auckland that they would not have without the unitary plan and other measures. And I think this is an historic day that a generation were able to rise up, thanks in part to a really aggressive reporting and media activity by the likes of Joel, but also, this was well covered by RNZ, the Post, and also TVNZ had a bit of a crack at it. And I think it matters. We essentially had a debate in real time about the future of housing in this country. And at least in one city right now, it looks like we had a victory. And they're not very common, so you have to celebrate them. A YIMBY victory. But it's not over yet. And as Stuart says, it's necessary but not sufficient, and we will see how the government reacts. And also, I'll be interested to hear, I would love to be a fly on the wall in that caucus room next week when they come back to Parliament, and every blue-haired letter to the editor writer in Wellington will have rung up their local national MP in the dead of night and told them that the world's about to end and they have to stop this crazy densification of Wellington. So I don't think the story's over yet, and I think the key person here, rightly or wrongly, is the Prime Minister, who has been remarkably, let's call it, flexible on this idea that we need extra supply to solve our housing crisis. Chris Bishop.
But is it? What about this question of tax deductibility, though?
Oh yes.
I mean, is it just evening out any other source of investment? I mean, I tell you that it is not tax deductible in the UK. I can tell you that.
That's interesting. I'm actually a tax purist on this. I think we should have kept tax deductibility for interest for rental property. It's caused all sorts of grief across the board. We now have this crazy situation where all sorts of legitimate business costs for property owners are now deductible and not deductible. One of the changes that's going to go through at the moment is commercial property depreciation, which the previous national government mucked around with as well. So I'm a bit of a purist, but if you're going to be a tax purist about broad base and low rate, you better be a tax purist about broad base and low rate for capital income and, in my view, land. I'm a fan of a land tax, a tax on the value of residential land, and using that money to build the infrastructure needed for new housing and to change the incentives in our economy. Because in essence, at the moment, you can borrow money easily from a bank against a mortgage on a piece of residential land and gear up and collect tax-free capital gains. That isn't affected by the interest deductibility changes.
Sounds pretty bloody good to me, Bernard.
Well, this is how the world works in New Zealand, and the problem is it's locked out a generation of home buyers. It has increased rents to the brutal levels where we now have the most expensive and stressful rents in the developed world, and it is tearing one generation apart from another. And I think today we had another one of those flashpoints where the young people said, enough, let me live in my city in a sane, affordable way, get out of my way. And those people who are very wealthy because of this current setup are not going to get out of the way easily. And what we'll see in the coming weeks and months is a fight.
Jesus, you're talking about insurrection. You are going the full. You're going the full Sean Plunkett here.
I've seen those National Party meetings where people have screamed at Chris Bishop and said, "Don't you dare create these shoe boxes," and also just
on my tennis court
brackets. Yeah. Don't you dare create lots of new apartments that are going to compete with my rental properties that are making good money. Thank you very much.
Bernard, why don't we have tax deductibility of all mortgages like they have in the United States? Of that, tax deductibility on the house that you own. I mean, that was rather good.
Yeah, that's one way to even up the playing field, but I'd prefer a simple land tax as a way to do it, and also to adopt a conventional approach to the taxation of savings and pensions. In New Zealand, there are no tax breaks for savings and pensions, and it means that we've got this horribly skewed investment landscape where it makes a lot more sense to put any spare cash into a residential property rather than an actual business or a pension fund.
And who was it, Bernard, who undermined those incentives on pensions and savings?
Well, it was an accidentally on purpose thing involving both National and Labour through the late 1980s and early 90s. The removal of the tax breaks for pensions, which on the face of it looked like a good idea because you were essentially stopping giving money to people already rich. But the combination of that with not imposing a capital gains tax, and you've got to remember the 1989 Labour government proposed a capital gains tax, they just weren't popular enough to get it through, has left us with us being the only place in the world with a combination of no capital gains tax and no incentives to save in pension schemes. And the end result, because of our geography, means we are sitting right next to a country which has a much more conventional setup, where they have a proper set of capital markets and savings with proper incentives and capital setups to invest in infrastructure, and that is Australia. And lo and behold, they've got 30 to 40% higher real wages than we do. And just today, we got new migration figures showing record outflows of New Zealanders going to live in Australia.
And as we know from Muldoon, Bernard, they raise the IQ of both countries when they leave.
Well, what we do...
Since we're back in the Muldoon
say in
era.
my soliloquy, because our producer is tearing his head, tearing
He hasn't got
his
there. Don't worry
follicles
about it.
and saying, what I would say is, please, Australia, use those submarines that you're about to get to invade us, to take us over as an Australian state, so we can have your capital gains tax in the pension system and your wages. And that's yeah. Anyway, I'd like to.
All right, shall I do the skateboarding dog while
Thank you very much,
Stuart's there?
Stuart, for jumping in.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
It's really
Thanks, Peter.
So,
Thanks, Bernard.
shall I do a Swifty on the skateboarding dog?
Yes, please.
And as I said to you before, it's usually a royal free zone. Pathetic and extraordinary story going on about the Princess of Wales in the UK. I thought I'd draw people's attention to an interesting piece in the Independent. I have been through some of these kinds of incidents before as a reporter in the UK or as a journalist working in the UK. And what people do sometimes is they know what's going on, but there's various reasons why they might not publish quite what they know. So they'll do their absolutely best to hint at what might be going on. So there was a story in the Independent 3 days ago which says, who is the Marchioness of and that is, as you said before, Cholmondeley, but it's Cholmondeley. Who is the Marchioness of Cholmondeley? And I think you'll find she's a rather glamorous, rather wealthy person whose husband, 23 years her senior, is the Earl of Rock Savage, which is possibly one of the great names other than Cholmondeley. But it would be worth looking this up and seeing what connection she might have to the various Kate stories.
And if you're looking for an entertaining and clear description of what's going on, that means that we don't have to publish the details and get sued by anyone.
Correct. Correct.
Just Google Stephen Colbert and
that too, yeah.
Cholmondeley. And
Cholmondeley, yeah.
Yeah. It just reinforces
Phonetics.
the weird nature of our media landscapes where we have to find out about British gossip from US talk shows.
That's true.
And
nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
nudge, nudge,
Say
wink,
no
wink,
more.
wink. Yeah. Peter, thank you very much for dialing in
See you, Bernard.
from the centre of the universe today, which is Wellington.
Absolutely.
And we look forward to having everyone on
And
again.
thank you, everybody.
Our Hoon next week. Ka kite anō, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.